And while I'm a nurse, I also have a business degree. I know a little bit about economics, and I live in Congressman Ron Paul's congressional district, and he's tried to teach me a lot about the Austrian economic thinkers. And if you watch the Austrians, they're telling us that everything Washington, D.C. is doing with our monetary supply, doubling the money, is likely to put us right where Germany was some years ago in a period of hyperinflation and in a time when the value of the dollar continues to decline. I hope that's not where we're headed, but my job as a nurse is not to just wish you good health, it's to be a good assessor of what the signs and symptoms are showing me and to react accordingly. So I've got to look as a nurse treating Texas as to what the signs and symptoms are showing us and be prepared to have done everything that I could if I'm going to be your governor and I'm going to be a good one to protect this economy from whatever that one is doing. Are there things that Texas can do? We've got the 13th largest economy in the world. Are there things that we can do, and what are those things? And I get back to the beginning and I began to read some more the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers, and I run across some writing by Thomas Jefferson. The prevailing argument of the day was we don't want a big federal government. We like being independent states. We're concerned if we create this big federal government that we are going to be back where we just fought to get away from. And the authors of the Constitution said, we got it. Article 1, Section 8 clearly defines what the federal government can do. The colonists said, not enough. The founders said, 10th Amendment, those powers not expressly given to the federal government are reserved to the people and the states. And Jefferson's writing in particular said, it is the unquestionable right of the states to determine when the federal government steps outside of that compact. It's not Washington's job to come knocking on the Capitol in Austin and say, hey, ladies and gentlemen, we just want you to know that we're going to add on to Article 1, Section 8, and we're going to do something. It's Texas' job to stand up and say, you have no authority here. You have no authority. Unquestionable right of the state, and the rightful remedy is nullification and interposition. And every time I say that, someone says, tell us what that means. Nullification is a tool that the legislature uses. The Montana legislature used it a few years ago when the federal government passed Real ID, and Montana said, you have no authority here to tell our state how we identify our citizens. We'll decide. And you have no authority. They used it again just recently regarding federal gun laws and ammunition. 13 of our sister states as of last November had introduced nullification language against the federalization of health care. Texas sits on her hands and twiddles her thumbs while Washington continues to take and take and take, and government continues to grow. Nullification is the rightful remedy available to the state legislature. They passed a law that says that federal action, that's not federal law, you don't have a constitutional authority to do that, you can't give it the rank of law. That federal action that you took is illegal in this state and it will not be enforced here. Interposition is a tool available to the executive. The executive is responsible for overseeing the agencies, whether it's a federal agency or a state agency. The executive oversees the agency and he provides direction to them to enforce the laws that the legislative branch passed. Interposition is a tool where the governor says, TCEQ, the EPA has no constitutional authority and we will not be doing their dirty work in Texas. Taxpayer dollars are used to enforce Texas law. And when you get the EPA off the back of Texas agriculture and Texas energy and Texas manufacturing, and you say to those hardworking entrepreneurial Texans, get out there and get after it, we won't have an energy crisis in this country. And we won't have an economic recession in this country. I've done 9 or 10 interviews now today, and several of those reporters have said the Texas economy is in pretty good shape, and they're drinking the Kool-Aid or reading the tea leaves or whatever. Let me tell you where we really are as Texas, because I think that we deserve honesty from our government, and we cannot make good decisions if we're given bad facts. We have heard that Texas is better off, and we may in fact be better off than our neighbors, but all of America is suffering in an economic recession. The state of Texas had $12 billion of debt when Governor Perry took office 9 years ago. We have over $37 billion of debt today. It has tripled. Our debt has tripled. Now, we've done that to ourselves when we vote on these constitutional amendments. That's where the debt comes from. But nobody has stood up and said, you're maxing out the credit limit, Texas. Nobody has come to us and said, we're tripling our debt. If they did, we might have voted differently in some of those November constitutional elections. We've tripled our debt. We're making our debt payments, we're making our mortgage payment, we're making our note payment. That's why we get away with saying we have a balanced budget. We're spending every dime we take in, we've tripled our debt. None of us would call that a balanced budget in our home. But our governor has gotten away with telling us we have a balanced budget because we're making the mortgage payment. We have a constitutional debt limit ceiling in Texas, a credit limit, if you will. That ceiling says we cannot spend more than 5% of our income, 5% of our revenue to retire our debt. We're at 4.85% today. So we've essentially maxed out our credit limit. Texas is either going to cut her spending or she's going to do what Washington just did. She's going to raise the debt threshold. Anybody interested in raising the debt threshold? No. So we've got to understand that we've taken on all the debt that we can take on as a state. In fact, if we don't take on another dime of debt, as the amortization schedule runs, everybody that's ever taken on a debt, you know it takes time to pay it off. As the amortization schedule runs today, we don't take on another dime of debt, the state of Texas gets out of debt in 2047. We're talking about job growth in Texas, and I don't know if your community is like mine, but I suspect it is. Your neighbors have been laid off, or their hours have been reduced from 40 to 36 to 32 to 30, or they've been put on part-time status. And you keep hearing about job growth in Texas and wondering where, because it ain't in my community. And I began to study those numbers. And in fact, in January of 2007, we had let me back up. In November of 2009, we have 142,000 more people working in Texas than we did in January of 2007. So you think we've added 142,000 jobs to the Texas economy, and that's a good thing. That number comes from the U.S. Department of Labor Statistics, and if you'll scroll down that report a little bit, you'll see that it looks at the categories where those jobs came from, and the first category is the construction industry, and the curve from January 2007 and November 2009 does that. And you get to IT, and it does that. And every sector you look at, the curve just drops off the chart until you get to the bottom, and it's the government sector, and that curve does that. See, we've added 156,000 government sector jobs in Texas in the last 2.5 years. There's 14,000 fewer private sector employees supporting 156,000 more government sector employees. That's why there's a recession in Texas. That's why we're hurting in Texas. We've added jobs, but they've been public sector government jobs. We've lost 14,000 jobs and added 156 to the government sector. And while the governor is out there saying everybody needs to tighten their belt, spending in the executive branch the governor's in, the one he's responsible for, has gone up 13.5%.